Amen. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which we studied last time, or at least we finished that study last time. Now we go on to John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. Why were they called the Synoptic Gospels? They cover a lot of the same material. They distinctly resemble one another. And synoptic means that they see together. It means that they see together. But then you have John, because it differs fairly significantly from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the Gospel of John kind of has individual scenes of the life of Jesus, where you've got more of a continuous history of the Lord's life in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I did say last week and the week before that these Gospels aren't really so much biographies of the Lord. Even though we call them biographies, that's I think maybe a word of convenience perhaps. Why are they not precisely biographies? Why are they not really biographies? And a biography is just essentially, what does a biography do? It tells you someone's life from beginning to end. Is that the reason for the Gospels? The reason the Gospels exist is to tell you what? The good news. Now, along with the good news, you have the birth and the life of Jesus Christ. But they're not biographies in the strictest sense because they're there to tell you this good news. And John's Gospel even deviates even more so from that. John's Gospel tries to present Jesus as an object of faith, whereas the other three present Him more as a historical figure. Now, there's a reason for that, which we'll get to in just a second. There are basically 7 events in the life of Jesus Christ. There is the birth, the baptism, the temptation, the transfiguration, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke present those. John more tries to interpret it. What did all of it mean? How do you put it all together? Again, for a very specific reason. So the first 3 show us Jesus outwardly. John shows us Jesus inwardly. The first 3 emphasize the human aspects of Jesus Christ. John really kind of reveals the divine. The first 3 talk about the Galilean ministry. And this is important because the Galilean one was by far the one that people responded to. So he had much more success in the Galilean work than he did in the Judean work. Matthew, Mark, and Luke cover that Galilean work, but John deals more with the Judean work. The first 3 are factual. John is more doctrinal. Matthew and Luke deal with the human genealogy, a fulfillment of prophecy. John begins at what point? Where does John begin? He does not begin with a genealogy. John goes all the way back into, he goes all the way back into eternity. And again, a very, very different approach. This is why in the very first lesson that we had, I showed you that chart, and in that chart, 90% of the Gospel of John is unique. None of the other Gospels cover it. So, the Gospel of John, for this reason, was probably written at a time when the church was composed of 2nd and 3rd generation Christians. And this is a very common progression. you have Jesus on the earth. He was able to be resurrected. He ascended. People saw that. They were amazed by that. They were convinced by that. They turned to that through the preaching of the apostles and the prophets. But what happens as time goes on? First of all, memory fades. And what else? This is human nature. This happens in every single age. Every single generation it happens. You kind of lose the sense of amazement to it, and you begin to try to what? Explain it. You begin to try to rationalize it. So once we reach kind of the second and a third generation of Christians, and remember, the second and third generation of Christians is not the second and the third century. We're getting to the second and third generation of Christians before we're reaching the second, well, maybe not the second, but the third and fourth centuries. And people are starting to try to understand it, to rationalize it, to explain it. Well, guess what happens when you try to do that? You start going off into error. And John is written to kind of corral people away from that error, because that's the direction that it's going. People's understanding of who Jesus Christ was and His divinity versus His humanity by the time we reach the end of the second century is really, really starting to change. We look around and there's a tendency in 2025 for us to observe all these different systems of beliefs and ideas around in us, and we get discouraged because we think it's so bad, I can't imagine it being any worse. But it was essentially just as bad in the first century. There may not have been quite as many varied ones, but it was just as bad in the first century. And John's gospel is a reaction to that. John's gospel basically proves that here was John trying through the Holy Spirit to stop some of that doctrinal deviation. A new presentation was necessary because you had changing times. And when you had changing times, you had to bring people. John chapter 20, verse 31, you're trying to bring people to what? To belief. You're trying to bring people to belief. You're trying to bring people to faith. If you're changing the message, you can't do that. That's why we have John's new message. So, John is a very deep understanding of God. You've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, especially Matthew, but who's written more to a Jewish audience. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke appeals to Gentiles as well, especially Mark and Luke. But John really appeals to everyone, because the point of it is to try to show and to prove that eternal nature of God. And that's going to be, of course, applicable to everyone. And why sometimes so many people actually love the Gospel of John and are fond of the Gospel of John even more so than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A lot of people love Matthew, maybe because it's the first one. And if you're going to have an experience with any of the Gospels, you kind of pick the first one. So it seems like it's kind of down between Matthew and John. And one of the reasons with John is because it's just so different, and it deals with everything in such a different way. It does, though, bring up a lot of different points of view, like John the Baptist, Herod's building of the temple, Annas and Caiaphas. It talks about Pontius Pilate. Talks about the Roman domination of Palestine. So it's got all of these elements in it that should be notable to Jews, but John has more of a desire to talk about eternity than he does to deal with these elements in time. So that makes it very different. John the Baptist, when John talks about John the Baptist, he doesn't really talk about his preaching. What was John the Baptist preaching, by the way, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. John decides to deal more with Jesus picking his disciples and these interactions with the disciples as those disciples are chosen. There's also the whole idea that John is concerned with the nature of Jesus Christ rather than all of the moral kind of teaching that especially Matthew has, and Matthew has a lot of. The miracles. How many miracles are in the Gospel of John? I mentioned that there's 35 of them that are recorded, but how many miracles are in the Gospel of John? Only 8 of them. And this is way lower than the rest of them. And only one of them ends up being a copy of the other 3 Gospels. So it has only 8 miracles, but 7 of them are unique. We don't know about them any other place. The one miracle that all 4 of them record is the feeding of the 5,000. And we'll talk about why that one is important, why I think they all recorded the feeding of the 5,000. But because normally if you would have thought about a miracle that all 4 of them would have recorded, which one would you have thought of? Which one would you have thought of? If you were going to have a miracle that all 4 of the Gospels would have recorded, for me, it wouldn't have been the feeding of the 5,000. Which one would you have picked? And there's not going to be a wrong answer. Maybe water to wine? Lazarus, someone getting raised from the dead? You probably wouldn't have picked Jesus feeding the 5,000. I think there's a reason for that. The feeding of the 5,000 marked a major turning point in the whole work of Jesus, in that whole 3+ years of Jesus. Personally, that's why I think that all 4 Gospels mention it, because it's such a critical point in His work. But that is indeed the only one that's done. The chronology is different. I'll bring this up a little bit more, but the events of the Last Supper, His betrayal, His hearing before Pilate are very different. The resurrection with John, all the resurrection appearances in John, very different than the resurrection appearances of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, John wrote as a first-hand witness, making this special presentation of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke knew a lot of facts, of course, about Jesus Christ, but John records a lot that they just never did record. And some of that gives a lot of insight into what is taking place. And I gave you an example of this, and it coincides with the sermon this morning about Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Now, Jesus washing the disciples' feet is not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but something else of some element of turmoil is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not in John. So what's that little element of turmoil mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke around the Last Supper? Do you know? Okay, there was a specific way that you sat around where, and I'll show you pictures of it, but there was a particular way that you sat when you reclined at dinner, and they were fighting over what? Where they were going to be, which only shadowed a larger issue of what? Well, it just shadowed a larger issue of the disciples and how you what? In the army, not everyone has the same what? Rank. So how do you rank them? How do you rank us? Where do we stand? Lord, tell us. Explain it to us. What was the Lord's answer? Well, The ones that are going to be first are going to be last, and the last are going to be first. So his answer was, he wasn't there to assign them levels of prominence. They had to learn what? They had to learn to serve each other. And so, of course, the tremendous way to illustrate that, only John records. But if you put all four of them together, it opens up the entire account and why Jesus just all of a sudden grabs a towel and a water basin. They didn't want to wash each other's feet because they're ready to get ranked. They're like, look, time's growing. You keep telling us the time's growing short. So who's going to be the second in command? Who's going to be the third in command? Jesus teaches them through washing their feet, which only John beautifully records, that they were all going to be servants of one another. They weren't going to be ranked. But that's part of that beautiful part of what John adds that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't. Okay, and then just one thing. One of the marked features of John's gospel is his partiality to personal interviews. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do what? How do they cover the life of Jesus? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And admittedly, Luke doesn't do it Mark doesn't do it as much. But what do they do? In the big doctrinal or moral or ethical discussions, those discussions frequently took place in groups of people. And they recorded that. Of course, what is the greatest of all of those examples? The Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew and Luke both record it, but they just put it in different places, which we'll explain that as we get to it. But John deals more with personal interviews, and it's more front-loaded in the book because, of course, half of John's gospel, or almost half of John's gospel, deals with that final week. But his conversations with Nicodemus, the woman of Samaria, the nobleman of Cana, the paralytic in Jerusalem, the blind man, Mary and Martha in Bethany, all of these interviews were important because they were different classes of society. They were men and women, which, of course, back in the first century was what? Was unusual. It was kind of taboo. But Jesus showed that He had come not for just men and then let it trickle down to the women. Jesus came for who? Jesus came for everyone. Whether you were a Jew or you were a Samaritan or you were a Gentile, whether you were a man or a woman, you see the universal appeal of Jesus in John. And that's shown not by the fact that He just stood there and addressed a large multitude of everyone, but through all of these personal interviews that flow through the book that deal with all of these different types and classes of people. It really is very, very neat. And it illustrates the nature and the consequences of belief, the whole idea of concern. Okay, so one of the issues of trying to put John with Matthew, Mark, and Luke are just simply the way in which the chronology is shaped, the way in which the chronology falls. For example, in Matthew chapter 4 and verses 11 and 12, let's just read that. In Matthew chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, I want you to see something. And it's actually kind of amazing. Someone read Matthew 4, verses 11 and 12. So Matthew 4, 11 and 12 is right after what? The temptation of Jesus. So someone read Matthew 4, verses 11 and 12. So in between those two verses are the first 5 chapters of John. So that's how different the chronology in John is going to flow compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Literally between Matthew 4, 11, and 12 are the first 5 chapters in John. When you get another example, between John 5 and 6 is most of where, when Denise had read that he was going to go to where? Where was he going? To Galilee. Between John 5 and 6 is most of that Galilean trip, which actually turns out being a large part of Matthew and Luke. And John doesn't mention it at all. It just occurs between one single chapter division between 5 and 6. And then finally, in John chapter 10 and verses 21 and 22, there's several months between John 10, 21, and 22. And again, in those several months, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's lots and lots of material that's taking place. But for John, if you look in John 10, 21, and 22, it's just a mere notation of time. So understanding the chronology between all 4 of them can be very tricky, not only because of the chronological gaps, but also because of the fact that Matthew, Mark, and Luke tend to keep time along with the Jewish standard, while John, writing much later, tends to keep it along with the Roman standard. And that's going to make some discrepancies that, again, we'll get the opportunity to talk about later on. The last few minutes, let's just discuss the authorship and date. Papias, in AD 125, affirmed that Mark had recorded Peter's eyewitness and also said that Matthew had presented a teaching of Jesus as well. Another person very instrumental in the first couple of centuries, Irenaeus, wrote in 180, and he confirmed the traditional authorship of all of the Gospels. In fact, the writers of the Gospels were well known to people in the first century. So who was Matthew? He was a tax collector. He was an apostle. I mean, again, because of Matthew's Gospel, but also because of the other 2, Mark and Luke, who mention him, we're able to know who Matthew was. Mark, who was Mark? Also known as John Mark. So he was the son of Mary. Mary's mentioned in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, because in Acts 12, verse 12, the church met in her house. He was also kind of one more notable part to his life. He was the cousin of who? Barnabas. So you put all of that together. In 1 Peter chapter 5, Mark is a close associate of Peter. So Mark appears to be able to have his information through not only through inspiration, but also through that association with Peter. Now, because it's John Mark and because we've brought in Barnabas, of course, how else do we know John Mark? Right. But something happened, and so Paul didn't want to take him. Barnabas and Paul kind of split apart, and Paul selected who? Silas, to really travel with him the rest of his life. Whatever issue happened between Paul and John Mark, was it permanent? No, because in the end of Paul's writings, Paul is mentioning Mark and mentioning what he means to him. Luke is what? A Gentile. In fact, he's probably the only Gentile writer of the New Testament. And what was Luke? He was a beloved physician. Now, interestingly, how do we know about Luke? Okay, so Luke, as we'll see next week in Luke's gospel, he has eyewitnesses. He has interviews of the people. And he puts together this account of Jesus and of the Acts of the Apostles for Theophilus. In fact, Luke, being likely the only Gentile writer of the New Testament, is a person that, by and large, do we know a lot about or a little about? Actually, very little. But he wrote about a quarter of the volume of the New Testament. But we know very little about his actual life, his background, what happened to him afterwards. We just don't know. And then John, of course. Who was John? Disciple that Jesus loved. John, I told you that all of the Gospels strictly are what? All of the Gospels are strictly anonymous. Anonymous. John is kind of the only one that hints a little bit at it because he keeps referring to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. So who was he? Who was he? Okay, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, also known as a son of, somebody said it, a son of thunder. He was also part of the, so what would you call it? This is kind of our business speak today, but what would you call him a part of? What would we kind of in the inner circle, the business speak of the inner circle. He was part of the inner circle, along with who? Peter and his brother James. He was a big part of the work in the early church in Jerusalem. Acts mentions him both in chapter 3 and also in chapter 4, also in chapter 2, of course. He goes on later on, and he is ultimately in exile in Patmos, from which he writes the book of Revelation. It is important to note that as far as authorship is concerned, there are no other candidates for the authorship of the Gospels. So these were 4 individuals who were known to the early church, and there are no other competitors. So it's not like they've got a couple or 3 other people for every single gospel that if these guys didn't write it, I guess these people. No, there weren't those. So while they are strictly anonymous, it's pretty well established that these 4 individuals were actually the 4 who had written them. It just was not in dispute. Okay. All right, the context of Matthew, Mark, and Luke suggests that they were written before the fall of Jerusalem. Quickly, how was that established? And the way they wrote about the temple, that it was still there, it wasn't destroyed, and the way they wrote about what else? The Sadducees. Who were the Sadducees? Okay, they didn't believe. You could kind of summarize the Sadducees in a series of negatives. They didn't believe in this, they didn't believe in that. But they were also very what? They were very tied in with the high priesthood. So after the temple would have been destroyed, they were what? They were sort of kind of consigned to history after the temple was destroyed. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke consistently do what? Refer to them. I mean, multiple times, over a dozen times. So what does that likely tell us about Matthew, Mark, and Luke? It happened before the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so Matthew wrote in Aramaic, and so because he wrote in Aramaic, it is thought that his gospel was likely the first one. I did mention to you guys that as we go through this, these are things that I've kind of held so far for many years. I may not hold them the rest of my life. But right now, today, here's what I would say about the date of the Gospels. Matthew would have been written first in the 50s, and then likely Luke in the 60s, because Luke likely would have written when Paul was where? In prison in Rome or in Caesarea. So Luke in the 60s, and then Mark. It's relatively it's a relatively good traditional thought that Mark wrote after Peter died. And Peter died in the mid-60s. So Mark would have likely been written right after that. And then Luke or John somewhere in the 80s or 90s. This is very unusual in current modern day scholarship. Most people are going to reverse some of these, but this is what I think it is. And then just one more. The John Rylands fragment shows that John's Gospel was being copied by the time of 125. It's tiny. I'll have a picture of it eventually. It's only got like 3 verses on it, but it's widely considered that those 3 verses were written about 50 years, only about 50 years after John wrote that Gospel. It is an amazing piece of archaeology, an amazing piece of the New Testament. So we will begin in Luke chapter 1 with his prologue to the Gospel next week.